Welcome everyone, in this really nice sunny afternoon here at AUB. This is a public panel that, can you hear me over there? Yeah, this is a public panel that is stemming from the Human Rights Project that is basically co-led by Issam Fares Institute and Lund University in Sweden. And Lisa Hajjar and I have been recently kind of came on this project to be kind of the co-investigators leading this project from the AUB side. And we are very happy today to begin to kind of articulate some of the thoughts and some of the ideas that we're working with. And the project basically, the Human Rights Project here at Issam Fares with Lund University is a project that kind of seeks to advance the state of knowledge about the relationship among research, advocacy, and public policy in the Arab world. We're interested in analyzing the shifts in human rights discourse and practice, and assessing how continuing struggles for human rights across the region have been affected by the recent ongoing uprisings and pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian movements around the Arab world. So the project really is attempting to create a new platform for discussion between academics and practitioners to think about human rights not just as a kind of a universal discourse, but actually as a practice, and that emerges also through local processes, regional processes, and institutional kind of reformulation, and more activism and advocacy. So we're really trying to begin to map out how has human rights discourse been utilized by activists, by institutions, by different kind of actors in the Arab world to look at kind of the state of how the recent uprisings also have been or not been a platform for advancing certain notions of human rights. So today's public panel is actually a continuation of early morning discussions about looking at different case studies from different parts of the Arab world, from Yemen to Bahrain to Egypt to Lebanon. Today we're very happy to host this panel, and I guess I can turn the microphone to Lisa Hajjar to introduce the panelists for today.
Again, I want to concur with Omar Dewachi to welcome you all, and very glad we could be here. And we're really honored to have all four of these guests. I'm just going to give very brief introductions in the order in which they will be speaking. So the first speaker right here will be Mustafa Kamal Al-Said. He's a professor of political science and the director of the study for developing countries at Cairo University, and he also teaches at the American University of Cairo. And Dr. Al-Said has really been one of the longest, not to offend you, but oldest activists in the Arab world in terms of activism that's been going on both in Egypt itself, the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights, and the Arab Organization for Human Rights. Our second speaker will be Professor Sheila Carapico, who teaches political science and international studies at the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, and she's also a visiting professor at the American University of Cairo. And she'll be speaking about Yemen. Eli Abouaoun is the, Eli El-Hindi is a professor at Notre Dame University, and he runs the human rights program there. And he's also a chairman of the board of ALIF, which is the Act for Human Rights, and he'll be talking about Lebanon. And finally, last but not least, Maryam Al-Khawaja, who is the acting president of the Bahrain Center for Human Rights and the co-director of the Gulf Center for Human Rights. And she will be talking about the Gulf in general, particular focus on Bahrain, and we wanted to say that, you know, the role that she has been playing, especially now her father and her sister are both in prison, but she's played an instrumental role in trying to influence international policies towards Bahrain. So welcome to all the speakers, and we'll try and keep them each to about 20 minutes so that we can have a chance for questions and answers. So, Mustafa.
I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk at the AUB about what I think is, okay, yeah. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about the Arab uprisings at the American University in Beirut, and this is not the first time I come to this prestigious university. I think this should be my third or fourth time, so I'm very happy to have the opportunity to be again in this place. My talk is about the transitional phase in the Arab revolutions, this transitional phase is very important because the success of Arab revolutions in attaining their goals of well-being, freedom, dignity and social justice, عيش حرية, عدالة اجتماعية, كرامة إنسانية, depends very much on what happens during this transitional phase. So I'm going to talk about the way this transitional phase is managed in the 4 countries in which authoritarian regimes have been overthrown. And there are 2 ways of looking at the transitional phase. The professional political science definition of the transitional phase is that the intermediate phase between the overthrow of the authoritarian regime and the establishment of a democratic regime. However, there is a broader definition of the transitional phase. This is the phase between the fall of the old regime and the success in societal transformation. So, of course, the second definition is much broader. The success of the transitional phase does not depend only on the elaboration of a new constitution, the establishment of a new political system, but it depends very much on the success of transforming society. As you know, by profession, I'm a political scientist, so I'll talk mainly about the success in establishing a new political system, but I'm not downplaying the importance of the broader definition, because in fact the durable success of the transitional phase depends very much on the transformation of society. So what are the conditions for the success of a transitional phase? First of all, it should be of short duration. If the transitional phase is short, then it is successful. If it takes a very long period of time, it might not be successful. Secondly, also, the success of the transitional phase depends on achieving a sort of consensus on the outcome of this phase. There should be a sort of, broad agreement among the most important political actors on the outcome of this process. Also, the third condition for the success of the transitional phase is obviously its capacity to resolve the major issues, the major tasks of a transitional phase, which I'll talk about now. Who manages this transitional phase? In a country like Tunisia, the transitional phase is managed by a narrow coalition. I'm making a distinction between a narrow coalition of political forces and a grand coalition. A narrow coalition or a majoritarian coalition is a coalition which does not include all the important actors, but it does include those actors who succeed in getting the majority in elections. And this is the case of Tunisia. The kind of coalition that is running the government is made up of 3 parties which have the majority in an elected assembly. I would say that a grand coalition is better in managing the transitional phase than a majoritarian coalition, because the majoritarian coalition excludes some important political actors. A grand coalition is one that brings all the actors who were instrumental in the success of the revolution. But this is the case of Tunisia. A majoritarian coalition is running the transitional phase. In the case of Egypt, the transitional phase was managed by the military, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and later on is managed by a majoritarian government, or presumably a majoritarian government led by Muslim brothers. In Yemen, the transitional phase is managed by a leader who himself is a survivor of the old regime. So there is a sort of maintenance of the old regime through the person who has been elected as president of the Republic, who was the vice president of Ali Abdullah Saleh. In the case of Libya, it is also a majoritarian coalition. Now, what are the tasks which should be performed during this transitional phase? First of all, establishing law and order. This is very important because the success of the overthrow of the authoritarian regime means also success in defeating, eliminating the security forces on which this regime relied for its survival. So success in restoring law and order is a very important task for the transitional phase. And we know very well that the problem of security is very acute in Libya and in Yemen. It is also present in Tunisia and Egypt, but less acute than these two countries. The second task of the transitional phase is establishing transitional justice, doing justice to those who were persecuted before the revolution, trying the leaders of the authoritarian regime for the crimes they committed. And this is a task which is very important for this phase. The third task is framing the outline of a new political system. The old system is not the object of content, satisfaction. The revolution took place because people are unhappy with the old regime. So during the transitional phase, the foundation for a new political order should be established. Also, maintaining the territorial integrity of the country, keeping Yemen, Libya, Egypt, Tunisia together, keeping all the components of society in these countries content with their political community. Now, if these are the most important tasks of the transitional phase, how these tasks were accomplished, we look now at the record, at the performance of these actors who were in charge of managing this phase. In terms of establishing law and order, as I said, this is still an acute problem in Libya, where there is no police force, where the militias who overthrew Gaddafi maintain their prisons, organize trials. This is also a major problem in Yemen, with the Qaeda still active, with the Houthis in the north, and ordinary crime. This is also a problem in Egypt and Tunisia, but not as acute as in Yemen and Libya. In terms of transitional justice, this problem has not been resolved. In Yemen, people are calling for the trial of Ali Abdullah Saleh and members of his family, but there are no arrangements for this trial. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak has been acquitted, but there are new charges against him. And in fact, one of the reasons that the Muslim brothers are trying to change the law of the judicial authority is their wish to get a judiciary who would be capable of imposing some sort of penalty on Hosni Mubarak and the senior officials of his regime. So transitional justice has not been resolved in Egypt, has not been resolved also in Libya, where some members of the Gaddafi regime are outside of Libya, or they are in Libya, but there is no trial and there is no agreement on how to try them. This is also a major problem in Yemen. A third task is addressing the economic and social grievances of the people. These revolutions, although they called for democracy, but the masses, the hundreds of thousands or the millions of people who joined the protests did not do this because they wanted only establishing a democratic regime. They wanted well-being. They wanted higher wages. They wanted lower prices. They wanted, more efficient services. And in fact, this, explosion of socio-economic grievances was a feature of the post-revolutionary period. So in terms of meeting these socio-economic grievances, this has definitely been a failure in Egypt and Tunisia. This does not seem to be a major problem in Yemen and Libya, although there are grounds for dissatisfaction with the socio-economic situation. But political demands take the priority in these countries. There is no threat of national disintegration in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, but keeping the country together is a major concern in Yemen, where people in the south are calling for separation of the south and going back to the situation which had existed before 1990. And national integration also acquires a new meaning in a country like Egypt. National integration does not mean only keeping the borders of the country, maintaining territorial integrity, but integrating people like the Christians. The Christians feel that they have become marginalized after the revolution. Even under Hosni Mubarak, he had his Minister of Finance, who is usually the most powerful minister in a country which is going very fast towards capitalism. His finance minister was a Christian. Hosni Mubarak also made some efforts in order to deal with some of the grievances of the Coptic church. He appointed a governor, a Christian governor, in Upper Egypt. After the revolution, the military council tried to appoint the same person as governor, but was met by opposition of the Salafists. And, it gave back, it renounced this wish to appoint a Christian governor. So there were some steps which were taken by Hosni Mubarak in order to further integrate the Christian community. These steps, are completely forgotten under the Islamist government. There is also feeling among the Nubians and among the Bedouins of Sinai that they are not treated in the same way as other Egyptians. So, keeping the political community together does not mean only maintaining the borders of the country, but, giving, all the different groups in the country the feeling that they are treated on an equal footing. Another task is framing a new constitution, laying the ground for a new political order. And, Egypt has gone furthest in this sense. There is a constitution in Egypt, but this constitution itself became another issue of division among political forces. The non-Islamist political forces are not happy with this constitution because it brings back the religious institution to be a sort of censor on the actions of the government. It tries to maintain certain privileges for the armed forces. So Egypt, in fact, offers a lesson of what should not be done in the other countries. There is no constitution yet in Tunisia or Yemen or Libya. But I think if they are going to learn anything from the Egyptian experience is to avoid the mistakes, the errors that were committed in the Egyptian case, where there is a constitution but does not enjoy the consensus of the people. Foreign actors were active in the transitional phase, but their role was not very direct. In the case of Egypt and Tunisia. In Libya, they were instrumental in overthrowing the old regime, but they don't seem to be very active in influencing the transitional phase. In the case of Yemen, they were very instrumental in promoting a sort of compromise that led to the end of the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh, and they seem to be also, concerned about the transitional phase, but we don't see signs of how they influence this process. Now, if the process definitely has not been completed satisfactorily in the four countries, what are the reasons for this? One, possible answer is that we did not see, first of all, this is not pacted transition. I'm making the distinction between pacted transition, where the transition does take place along the lines of an agreement among the major political actors, And this has been the case in some countries of Latin America. In none of the 4 countries, with the exception perhaps of Yemen, there is no pact, there is no prior agreement among the political actors. So because of this, they have to find out the ways to run this process. This is one possible answer. Another answer is that there are fundamental disagreements among the political actors, and the fundamental disagreement centers on the role of religion, and therefore this complicates the process. That these actors cannot agree on procedures because the procedures are related to the substance. In other words, they cannot agree on how to move out of this phase because the way to move out of this phase influences very much the role of religion. So this basic disagreement among these actors makes the transitional phase in Arab countries very different from countries of Latin America or South Asia, where there was no fundamental disagreements. All the parties that fought for a democratic regime in Argentina or Brazil did not disagree on such fundamental matters. So this is another answer. A third answer is that we have a multiplicity of actors on both sides. If we can divide the major actors into Islamists and non-Islamists, and this is the case in Egypt and Tunisia, and is becoming the case also in Libya, less so in Yemen. We find that there are many actors on both sides. So the Islamists are not one homogeneous group, but we have the Muslim Brothers, and we have the Salafists, and we have the Sufis, and we have the radicals of the Islamic group. And within the Muslim Brothers also there are many voices. So the fact that there is no one single actor representing each side, complicates the process because when the Muslim Brothers try to make a concession, they would be attacked by the Salafists, and since they compete for the same political constituency, so therefore Muslim Brothers become reluctant to make this concession. The same thing also applies to the non-Islamist side, where we have political parties, we have revolutionary groups, and they do not agree among themselves. So the multiplicity of actors on each side complicates this process. We must add also that there is the incompetence of those who run the government, because they did not run the government before. They don't have an experience of running the government. So therefore we find them showing lack of knowledge, lack of experience, how to run the affairs of the government. So for this, we see reversals of decisions which they have made. So if there is one general conclusion that I can draw from this is that the absence of a grand coalition is one of the major causes, but the absence of a grand coalition itself needs to be explained, and it is explained by the fact that there are fundamental disagreements among political actors, and they are not ready yet to see that there is a possibility for them to reach a compromise while maintaining the fundamental differences. In other words, I think theoretically it is possible for the Islamists and non-Islamists to reach a compromise on the kind of political system with each party maintaining its basic ideology. If they see that they can agree on the procedures and keep substantive matters to be settled later on, I think this would ensure the success of the transitional phase. But so far, they do not see that they can reach a compromise on procedure, which should not jeopardize their chances of achieving their ideological goals. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me.
Sheila, do you want to try that one or the handheld?
I think this one's easier.
Okay.
The handheld, yeah, it's better.
So can people hear me clearly? Okay, if you can't, wave, all right? Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Issam Fares Institute for inviting me to be part of this conversation, which I understand to be a conversation about human rights activism in various countries in the Arab world, where we're trying to, on the one hand, understand the kind of large sweep including, for example, some common organizations like the Arab Organization of Human Rights, but at the same time to recognize the specificities of individual countries. And the individual country that I'm most familiar with is Yemen, although actually I've kind of lived through the revolution in Egypt, so I might put in a word or two about that, but appreciating also my colleague Mustafa Kemal al-Sayed for having done, I think, a good comparative perspective on the revolutions. So I've entitled this paper, of which I have only notes in front of me, Yemeni Human Rights Between Revolution and Counterterrorism. And so I think, you know, my basic operating hypothesis is that Yemen is one of the countries undergoing revolution, and some of the human rights challenges are very much part of what in English is so often called the Arab Spring, but in Arabic is the revolutions. But at the same time, Yemen is uniquely positioned as a theater for operation in the American counterterrorism campaign. And so there's a kind of odd juxtaposition, actually, in the paper, which I've been having trouble with, of two narratives that don't seem to belong in the same paper and which are frequently not discussed simultaneously. But so I'm trying to draw those together as a short story about human rights activism. And so for starters, I mean, just 2 minutes of Yemeni history, kind of, or the history of human rights activism in Yemen, really more or less dates to unification in 1990. And the period, I've called it before, an opening between 1990 and 1994, when a civil war broke out that kind of ruined, in many respects, the unity experience. There was a huge efflorescence of human rights activity in Yemen during that period. At one point, according to Amnesty International, for a brief period, granted, there were more amnesty branches per capita in Yemen than anywhere else in the world. But and showing, I think, a huge enthusiasm for the discourses of human rights. At the same time, both sides, you know, the two different Yemens that had unified, which was the South and the North, obviously, kind of adopted the discourses of human rights. In fact, the Amnesty International researcher at the time called human rights a stick that both sides beat one another with. Showing, I think, the importance of discourses of human rights at the popular level, or at least the intellectual elite level, so much so that both governments, although both of them were prepared to wage war rather than to, you know, accept anything close to democracy, nonetheless, we're speaking in human rights terms. So you have a very kind of complicated way in which those discourses are operating. Anyway, the two sides went to war in 1994. It was kind of mercifully short, and as wars go, relatively bloodless. One side beat the other one. The Southerners left. This is the very short version. Whereupon the old national security regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh was able to reestablish itself both in the north, where there had been this opening, this let-up of the police state, and in the south, which soon came to think of itself as being under occupation. As an American who lives a lot of the time in Richmond, Virginia, I think of the analogy of carpetbaggers and scallywags, you know, invading the American South after the Civil War. Human rights conditions, which frankly had not been good under the old South Yemeni regime, the PDRY, People's Democratic Republic, so-called, had improved briefly in the interim, but then they got worse in South Yemen. They also got worse in what had been North Yemen. And the kind of brief democratic experience, which led to a couple of rounds of reasonably competitive and fair elections by regional standards, deteriorated. the political security organization increasingly resorted to detentions and a certain number of disappearances. And probably worse than that, threats of same. So you'd get a call from the cousin of a friend saying, gee, you know, we heard you were saying this and that. Maybe you want to think twice about that. Kind of veiled threats, modes of intimidation, outright censorship of the press and intellectuals, and ubiquitous checkpoints. You know, very serious restrictions on mobility were a serious problem. During this time, you know, a number of human rights organizations which had been formed in the early 1990s continued to operate and in some ways became stronger. One of my colleagues, who's also a colleague of my friend Mustafa, Muhammad Abdul Malik Mutawakkil, introduced a human rights curriculum at Sana'a University, which was also taught at some other universities. And, you know, then these organizations attempted to, of course, document abuses by the regime, including the separate set of abuses around the al-Houthi rebellion and the crushing of the al-Houthi rebellion in the north near the Saudi border, and then also, again, the kind of ongoing repression of the south. I just wanted to name a couple of other human rights issues, including poverty, environmental catastrophe, to the extent that talking about environmental rights, really, environmental human rights really makes sense, particularly when it comes to the catastrophic difficulties of accessing water is a very important one. I could easily spend my whole 20 minutes on that, but I'm going to move on. So, you know, frustrations, as in so many other countries in the region, were seething. The uprising began in early 2011. There had actually been strikes and demonstrations and protests and certainly complaints going on in Yemen for a number of years by then. And Yemen, relative to at least some other countries in the Arab region, particularly in the south, but even in the north, you know, it was always possible to demonstrate a bit. So there was a sense that things were coming to a head. It wasn't a complete surprise, but it was very much sparked by the resignation of bin Ali and then Mubarak. And when those two resignations occurred, you know, hundreds, eventually at least hundreds of thousands of Yemenis took to the streets, particularly in March 2011. And on March 18th of 2011, there were a very large number of people amassed in what was called Change Square, Meydan Tahrir, outside of Sana'a University. And I think it was 53 individuals were shot dead by snipers. And then this galvanized a lot more rage, and in particular, really a striking number of resignations from the Foreign Service, from the Civil Service, and from certain elements of the military, and it caused a split in the military. So there's an analogy there to Libya in a way, but not exactly. But some of the key military commands, not headed by the sons and nephews of the president, defected from the regime. And then those factions started fighting with one another. So you had fighting within the regime, intra-regime, same tribe, same military regime. They started having street battles. The whole time, the so-called peaceful youth, the Shabab al-Silmiya, kept demonstrating peacefully. And there were a number of really striking things about that, again, that I don't quite have time to go into, but I want to name a couple of them. One is that even though Yemen is much smaller than Egypt, say a quarter of the population, I think they eventually clocked more demonstrator days than the Egyptians, because they just kept going and going and going through the year with people camped out and doing 200-kilometer marches and all kinds of things. So very sustained. That's one. Second one, more remarkable than elsewhere, I think, given the low starting point, was the role of women. I mean, Tawakkol Karaman won co-won the Nobel Peace Prize, but she's really only one among a number of amazing Yemeni women who have really made a huge difference in the movement and been recognized as such. Related to that, but a third point is just the change in kind of cultural production, performances, artistic production. Egypt and Tunisia, people claim that Facebook caused the revolution. In Yemen, the correlation was the reverse. So nobody was on Facebook until the revolution started. Now everybody's on Facebook, which became then a medium for, you know, exchanging YouTube videos and all that kind of stuff. And then the third thing that I think, again, there's a number of other things, but a third thing that I really want to emphasize is that armed tribesmen laid down their weapons to protest. So these are guys who carry Kalashnikovs to lunch. In other words, they never leave home without it, but we're leaving home without it to go and demonstrate. It's a remarkable thing to get people who have the weapons at hand to engage in armed struggle, to choose to demonstrate peacefully. And that's connected, I think, to the role of women and to the kind of, you know, unusual and sudden tolerance of women or appreciation of women as leaders because of the connection between arms and masculinity. So although the regime were shooting each other and occasionally shooting the protesters, the whole year-long uprising, peaceful uprising, continued nonviolently in spite of the fact that people were armed and prepared, could, if they wanted to, resort to armed struggle. So it's pretty impressive, really. In the meantime, there's another thing going on, which is what we nowadays, after some publicity in the past couple of months, as Americans, we call the drone war. So this same time, actually starting a little bit before the protest movement in earnest, we've seen a campaign of mostly American, but I'll come back to that in a second, extrajudicial assassinations of actually a couple of American citizens, which was before the uprisings began. That's Anwar Nasser al-Awlaki and his son, a teenager, completely innocent, and others, okay, in 2009, and now a continuing campaign throughout 2011, 2012, and up until quite recently, in other words, up until this week, which it continues kind of parallel to this peaceful uprising for change, and which reflects, I think, in my opinion, an incredible cynicism with regard to whatever purported American commitment there is to democracy, justice, and human rights in a place like Yemen. Because the United States policy has not been to treat Yemen as a place that's undergoing a democratic transition, but rather to treat it as a theater of operations against al-Qaeda that happens to be in the Saudi backyard. So American policy is to maintain the Saudi monarchy, and it's to fight against al-Qaeda, and it is not to encourage or respect or appreciate the legitimate rights and concerns of the Yemeni public. I said it's purported to be an American campaign because we do have also some evidence, although it's pretty hard to come by, that at least some of these strikes are actually Saudi rather than American, because in any case, it's a Saudi-American campaign against al-Qaeda in Yemen, most of whom are actually Saudis anyway, and not Yemenis. Or maybe they're Pakistanis or Somalis or other people who came to Yemen to join al-Qaeda there. In the meantime, this is just another swipe at Saudi Arabia. But I mean, there's a series of other human rights concerns confronting Yemenis right now that do stem from Saudi Arabia. One of them is the construction of a 2,000-kilometer wall between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And then consistent with that is a policy of expelling Yemeni workers from Saudi Arabia at the moment as part of the nationalization of labor. These two things together are going to be deeply problematic for a country that is already poverty-stricken and experiencing extreme forms of social and economic and environmental crisis. So, Yemenis are increasingly, the human rights community are increasingly concerning themselves not only with what is typically, I think, what we expect when we're thinking about human rights activism in a country like Yemen, you know, this kind of poverty-stricken third world place, which is violence by the government. But Yemeni human rights activists are increasingly also thinking about the violence that is coming from the United States and from Saudi Arabia. And I want to name two of those who are very prominent. One of them is actually the Minister of Human Rights. And if you're familiar with human rights at all, I mean, you know that a Ministry of Human Rights can definitely be a double-edged sword. But this minister, her name is Huraya Mashhour, and she is a legitimate human rights activist who is an opponent of the Saleh regime, and who has, among other things, drawn attention to the American drone strikes, insisting that this should be something that the United States and other outside powers would help the Yemeni judiciary to deal with through the judiciary, rather than providing an example of how to do extrajudicial assassinations of suspected regime opponents. And the other one, Lisa will like this, was this, just this week, this young man, Farah al-Muslimi, who is a young American educated Yemeni from a village. AUB, that's right, that's why I was going to mention it, sorry, and I was going to drop it. Okay, AUB alum. And it just so happened that last week there was a drone attack on his village, which caused him then to write a very moving article about it and to be invited to speak before the Senate, blah, 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 just this week. So he's really managed to draw quite a lot of attention to this. There are other people too. I mean, I can't possibly name all of them because there are a number of other very impressive individuals, but I thought I would mention those two, whose names are fairly accessible, and one of whom, again, is an AUB alum, to say that I think, in conclusion, probably, that for Yemenis in particular, I mean, there are the many challenges that Mustafa just talked about, which are the challenges of transitional justice and of human rights practices by a government which has hardly made the transition. There are the problems of living in an impoverished and ecologically untenable third world country. And then there are the problems which are brought by proximity to the Saudi monarchy, which is, of course, itself the antithesis of democracy, women's rights, and human rights. And my government, the American government, whose support for the Saudi government, which is the antithesis of democracy, women's rights, and human rights, and which is instead engaging in an undeclared, extra-legal military campaign, is exacerbating the human rights crisis in Yemen and providing, I must say, challenges to these brave individuals to really stand up not only against domestic forces of oppression, but international ones. So to make the final point then, there are peaceful revolutionaries in Yemen, including urban women and incredible numbers of youth and armed tribesmen who throw down their weapons, and they're facing three powerful counter-revolutionary forces, one of which is the members of the old regime who are fighting amongst each other, The next one is the neighboring monarchies, of which I blame Saudi Arabia in particular, but I have enough room for the other Gulf monarchies as well. And then the last one is the United States of America. Thank you.
Okay. I was asked, first of all, I'm very pleased to be with you tonight. I was asked to speak a bit about the human rights situation in Lebanon. And for those of you who are familiar with the Lebanese situation, it's a serious challenge to try to put Lebanon into any frame or any scale. Because, as I always tell my students, please don't take Lebanon as an example, because it's outside all scales and all charts and all logic even. So I'm going to attempt to give a little description of the human rights situation with a little focus on torture, a topic that the organization that I'm part of was working on a huge project between 2008 and 2011, which is torture in Lebanon. So we'll take a small overview, and then we'll go a bit into the details of torture, and then it will be up for discussion, I guess, to try to make some sense out of what I'm going to say. So the situation of human rights in Lebanon has been, to take the positive side, has been developing steadily since the end of the war. Mainly, it was not due to the government, as usual, because we know that the government in Lebanon does nothing. And that's why, most probably, we have a very active civil society. And it was due to this civil society and this activeness that the situation of human rights has been evolving steadily since the end of the war. Civil society organizations, whether national or international NGOs, were able to create a grassroots awareness to a range of issues related to human rights. And this, of course, has been coupled with the growth of human rights in the international perspective and the international pressure on Lebanon, on the Lebanese government growing. So we did achieve some steps forward. However, if I would try to describe the situation, I would say that the general trend of oppressive regimes is to, talk the talk of human rights and try to allow some flexibility, some places where it's not harmful, but whenever human rights touches on critical issues, it will be simply stopped. So if we compare in Lebanon, we would see that some issues were clearly accepted by the government. NGOs could talk about education, about poverty, about women's rights to a certain extent, about children's rights, even environment, and even migrant workers. And torture is a kind of special case. We'll detail a bit about that. But again, at any time where any topic would reach the level of being critical of the political status or threatening to the existing status quo, it will be stopped immediately. Other issues have been completely and drastically stopped at birth. For example, like the issue of refugees, like the issue of death penalty, and even to a certain extent, the issue of freedom of expression. And it might be surprising that the impression about Lebanon is that has a lot of freedom of expression, which is fine. You can say, to a large extent, whatever you like. However, this freedom of expression will not lead anywhere, and they will make sure it doesn't. This was, to a large extent, the situation in the 90s all the way till 2005. I'll try to talk a bit about the link with Arab Uprising, although, as we know, Lebanon cannot be classified typically into an Arab Uprising country. We'll talk about that. But before that, I would like to draw your attention to what I call schizophrenia, the Lebanese schizophrenia. Even when we deal with human rights, many times we accept human rights as long as they are for us and in our favor. But we stop believing in them whenever they get into things that we don't like. So yes, freedom of expression is excellent, but not for my migrant worker, right? Women's rights are excellent as long as my wife listens to what I say at home, right? Et cetera, et cetera. I will not give a lot of examples, but those who are familiar with the Lebanese situation know that very well and experience it every day. So this schizophrenia will also continue, and I will draw on it on the case of torture when I speak about it. Now, if we want to try to put Lebanon into the Arab uprising, I will try to explain, or I will try to consider the Arab uprising as the fact of the masses acknowledging or being aware of their ability to go down to the streets and consequently create some change. If you put the Arab uprising as that definition, then the Arab uprising happened in Lebanon in 2005, with people getting to the streets and being able to change the status quo that was considered hopeless. If you put the Arab uprising as the situation that is currently happening and as a change of regime, unfortunately in Lebanon we don't have the luxury of revolting against the regime because, as Ziad Rahbani says, we don't have a regime. You need to have a regime before you can revolt against it. In Lebanon we have nothing to revolt against. And once we revolted in 2005, the people who are the problem came in and sat with us, right? So they were helping us to change. But change what? We want to change them. And they are with us, helping us to change. And consequently, we changed nothing. And quickly, the political agendas aborted whatever mass popular movement happened in 2005 and quickly went into the small, tiny streets of political compromises and political interests of individual leaders. Unfortunately, we're happy about that. We'll talk about it a bit more. So, if I'm gonna draw a bit on the case of torture, which I'm a bit familiar with due to the work that was done, let's take it as an example, and we'll say that if you want to study it, you have to first see what is the situation of Lebanon in comparison to international standards. As usual, Lebanon is very good in signing things, but we never apply them. So we did sign the United Convention on Convention Against Torture, and in 2008 we did sign the optional protocol on the National Prevention Mechanism, but of course we didn't apply any of those. So we're still trying to create a National Human Rights Action Plan, we're still trying to create a National Human Rights Institute, and we're trying to create a National Prevention Mechanism for torture. All of them are in draft laws to be studied by committees in the parliament, and I guess we all know what happens when something goes into committees. So we're hoping that something is gonna come up there and actually translate Lebanon's international commitment that are excellent into actual facts on the ground. Actually, the Lebanon report for the UN CAT is only 13 years behind. Still working on it. Concerning the legal problems, we signed the instruments, but we did not change our legal system. Torture in Lebanon is still not a crime. The worst that can happen is that the testimony or the words of the person under investigation will not be taken into consideration by the judge if he can prove that that person was tortured. But that's the end of it. Nobody's going to be punished for torturing someone. Okay? No problems are there. There's no crime there. The worst thing that can happen is some disciplinary letter that was sent to that someone. And again, now we're talking about the legal investigation, let alone the illegal ones. We'll talk about it a bit later. Another point is that we don't have any monitoring mechanism. So nobody monitors what happens in interrogation centers. And we have a lot of those, and they're increasing. In every corner, you can see an interrogation center. And we have more and more agencies that are able to abduct you all of a sudden from the street and interrogate you. We're creating more ones, as if we don't have enough. Going from the legal problem to the actual prison situation, which is by itself, it's a state of torture, in my opinion. Because when you go to prison in Lebanon, you're not going for rehabilitation in any way. You're not going for correction in any way. You're going for a school of more criminal acts. You're going for a physical torture due to the situation you are in, the health situation you are in, the environmental situation you are in, and the kind of violence that you suffer from, whether physical, whether mental, whether oral, etc., etc. The prison situation also suffers from many problems. We don't have time to go through those. I'll just mention some of them. The issue of interrogation centers, we mentioned that. The prisons are run by the Interior Ministry instead of being run by the Justice Ministry. Medical doctors who performed tests to see whether a person was tortured or not, or if he needs help or not, they are linked to the prison management and not to the health ministry. So they can always make sure to satisfy their paying authority. We have many cases of arbitrary detention and also delays in trial. We've seen and we all know of cases of people who have been in prison for 3-4 years and they haven't even seen a judge so far. Conditions of detention, as we mentioned, and also the lack of training, of any training or any conceptual understanding of the security forces of what does it mean human rights or what does it mean torture altogether. Now, very quickly, if we want to look at who is vulnerable for torture in Lebanon. Of course, everybody is, but some people are more vulnerable than others. And according to our studies, we've seen that these categories tend to be much more suffering from aggressiveness and torture. I'm going to name a few of them: the drug addicts and drug traffickers. I will name migrant and refugees, especially those who don't have proper papers. I'm going to name LGBT, lesbians and gays, and all sexually deviant person from what they think is the norm. And finally, a big topic of national security and alleged terrorism and people who are accused of being spies. Now the last category will also suffer from torture, and we've seen cases that these people not only suffer of torture by the hands of the official authorities, but sometimes even by other non-state actors in Lebanon who can, by de facto power, abduct them, investigate with them before they hand them over to the Lebanese government. A very important thing that we tried to draw on in our studies and that was not really very well covered in previous studies is the social and cultural acceptance of torture. We accept torture. We are violent people by nature in our life, in our songs, in our education of our kids. Can you imagine a lullaby that says, I'm going to kill Tayr al-Hamam for you? They're going to massacre what do you call it? The pigeon for the kid so he can go to sleep. I mean, I can't understand that. Trying to say another thing, another campaign was with the organization of Ab'ad that is Darb al-Habib Zbib, right? So you can, the more you hit your partner, the more you love him. And the topic for our campaign was Azebu Raha, right? We said Azebak mish Raha, and nobody's suffering can be any source of. Now, of course, this does not mean that we are all aggressive, hatred, and ugly people. No, we're not. But this is just simply part of our culture. We simply need to be aware of that. And again, for example, if one of us who was continuously slapped by his parents in order to educate him, right? So what's the big deal if he goes to interrogation center and he gets a slap in the interrogation center? That's not torture, come on. What about violence and torture? I mean, that's not torture. We just swear at each other and as we're driving like 10 times in a minute. So the whole concepts that we have about what is torture and how to face torture, I think in the parallel track that we have against government and against lobbying and advocating for better laws and for better standards, we also have a huge fight against ourselves and against our concepts of what is a human rights, what is torture specifically in the case that we are studying. The situation since 2005, as I said, we never had a proper government in Lebanon, but we have even improved on that. Since 2005, we literally have no legitimacy for any authority or any government happening anywhere, because any authority that we have is delegitimized by others, and its legitimacy and its authority is questioned. We have continuous instability. We have the rule of law is decreasing everywhere. Authority of the state is diminishing. Non-state actors are increasing in effectiveness and in actions. we have a lack of basic reference to a common value or a common norm. This sounds very pessimistic, I know, but I want to say that Lebanon is going through a transitional phase, exactly like other Arab countries are going through a transitional phase. But the good thing about it is that once we have broken that barrier of fear and barrier of imprisonment, mental and physical imprisonment, I think we can no longer move backwards. I think this did happen in Lebanon 5 years earlier. We're still in a transitional period, which is a sign that transitional period in other Arab countries is going to be as long, at least. But the hope, the difference is that we're moving to a more brighter future. So finally, my final message is that in times of transition, when all references is scattered and agreement on anything is questioned, like the situation today in Lebanon, let's try to make dignity of the human being our reference and our common value. And let's base on it, on the dignity of the human being, any future building that we will build and that we will erect in our societies. After all, this is the only reality that we all agree on. It is the essence of our existence. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for this opportunity to be on this panel. Let's be very honest here. You know, we all know that the Khalijis have a certain stereotype or a certain reputation everywhere we go in the world, right? And I wanted to share a very quick story of something that happened to me here in Lebanon. I was in Beirut last year, and I was sitting in a coffee shop reading a book about Aung San Suu Kyi. And as I was reading, a Lebanese man turned to me and he asked me if I'm Khaliji, and I said yes. And then he said, "Can I say something, but I don't want you to get offended?" And I was like, "Sure." And he said, "This is the first time in my life that I've seen a Khaliji reading a book." Or reading. Or reading. And I didn't know whether to be offended or to take it as a compliment. I chose to do the latter so that I don't get angry. But there is that kind of stereotype about Khalijis, and you know, not only in the Arab world, but even in the West. And it's because of the type of Khalijis that choose to travel or have the money to travel around the world. But there's a lot of things about the Khalij or about the Gulf that people don't know. For example, people don't know that there are thousands and thousands of Emiratis who live in houses that are falling apart. People don't know that there are thousands and thousands of Saudis who don't have jobs and who can't afford to buy food to put on the table. People don't know that there are thousands and thousands of Bahrainis who are in prison and being tortured. And the list goes on. And I think, you know, this is one of the things that we're trying to change now. As Khalijis, we're trying to change the fact that there is no information or real awareness out there about what the Khalij really is. The Khalij is not petrol and money and, you know, these different ideas that they've been able to PR into the international community of what the Khalij is supposed to be. But rather, the Khalij is societies and people, just like everywhere else. People who also want to live with dignity and human rights and freedoms and liberties and so on. And what we've seen is, throughout the past 2 years, people have started to speak out more. We've started to see protests in Saudi Arabia in places that we never imagined. You know, Bahrain was one of the countries where we saw mass protests come out. In Kuwait, we're seeing protests happening all the time now, demanding that the Emir should not have the privileges to change things in the constitution whenever he wants. And so we are seeing a movement happening in the Gulf. But why is it different? And this is something that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about the Khalij in general for a minute, and then I'm going to turn to Bahrain because that's my focus. But what we've seen in the Khalij is that, unfortunately, because of their geopolitical, security, and economic relationships with places like the United States and the United Kingdom and most of the EU, they are able to get away with things that other countries are not able to get away with. Why is it that in Saudi Arabia, where they have a massive, countless list of human rights violations, we never hear about it? But when it happens in a place like Iran, the entire world knows. Why is it when, you know, a US citizen is kidnapped in a certain country, everyone hears about it? They make movies about it in Hollywood. But you have 3 EU citizens sitting in prison in Bahrain today. 2 of them were severely tortured. 2 of them are sentenced to life. and nobody knows about it. And there is this very massive, very clear situation of double standards. Of, yes, let's implement human rights where it's good for us to implement human rights because it serves a purpose for us. But in countries where there are allies, we pretend they don't exist. I started working in human rights about 3 years ago when I was about 22 years old. And I thought that there was an international system that we could turn to that could actually help us and protect and promote human rights. And I found out that that system doesn't actually exist, right? I went to the UN and I was like, hey, I'm Bahraini, we're being violated, need your help. And people turned the other way. And I realized that although in the 21st century, when I had hoped that we would be living in a world where people are equal because they're human beings, regardless of their political, religious, or any other type of affiliations, I found out that that was not the case. That my value as a human being at a place like the Human Rights Council depends on what passport I carry. And unfortunately, we still live in a world where a barrel of oil from Saudi Arabia is worth more than the blood of a Bahraini citizen. That's the reality of what we live in today in this world. Now, like I said, there are movements. What the Gulf countries are doing is they're using somewhat of the same tools. We saw, for example, in Bahrain and in the UAE, they started revoking people's citizenships. Basically, today you're an Emirati, tomorrow you're not. They freeze your bank accounts, they fire you from your jobs, and the list goes on. They started using, especially, the judiciary system as a tool to go after dissidents and human rights activists. Almost every human rights defender that we work with in Saudi Arabia is now either in prison or under a travel ban. They're not allowed to leave the country to speak out about what's happening there. And the same thing goes for several other countries, including Bahrain and Kuwait and others. In Qatar, for example, there was a poet who wrote a poem about, it's poetry, and part of it was a bit political. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment for that poem, which was, I believe, then reduced. But the fact that they can do that to begin with, right? Now, to speak a little more specifically on Bahrain, which is where I'm from, the Bahraini situation is actually different from most of that in the Gulf, because the Bahraini social fabric is actually different. For example, Bahrain was never made up of tribes, but rather families who depended on fishing and pearl diving to make a living. And so it was a very tight-knit community where people, depended on each other and everyone knows each other and so on. The civil rights movement in Bahrain is one of the oldest in the region. It dates back to the 1920s. Today the Bahraini government loves to blame Iran for everything happening in Bahrain. A few people go out and raise a banner in the street, they're like, Iranian influence. And it's funny because people in Bahrain have been making these demands of civil rights and civil liberties at a time when the Bahraini emir was lighting up a cigarette for the Shah of Iran. This is how far back these demands were being made. And yet they still use that excuse today. And so for every 10 years almost, since the 1920s, there's been some sort of uprising in Bahrain. There was one in the 1920s, in the 1930s, in the 1950s, in the 1970s, in the 1990s, and now. What people are demanding in Bahrain is something very simple. They started by demanding reforms and demanding that the king of Bahrain deliver on the promises that he made in 2001. He promised a constitutional monarchy, and he never delivered. Instead, he changed the constitution that he promised that he would not change, the constitution of 1973, and instead created a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, where he announced himself king, where he was a prince before, and created a parliament that has no legislative or monitoring power, and said, you know what, I'm in control now, but this is your constitutional monarchy. Because you have a parliament, you can at least elect people. Of course, those elections don't actually mean anything. People, because of what had happened in the 1990s, and the 1990s was a very bad time where you could basically leave your house and not know if you're coming home again. And so people didn't want to go back to that. So they said, you know what, let's give him a chance. Or even if we don't give him a chance, we don't really have hope that we can actually make a change. So let's leave it be. This is better than the 1990s. But what I always like to say is that the revolutions of 2010 and 2011, they didn't cause each other. They inspired each other. Because each of these countries had a reason to take to the streets. Whether you're talking about Bahrain, or Syria, or Egypt, or Yemen, or Libya, or Tunisia, or otherwise. All of these countries, if you look at them, there are so many different things that were in common that caused these revolutions to happen. Whether you're talking about torture, or arbitrary arrests, or corruption, or absolute political power. All of these things existed in these countries. So these people didn't need a reason of, saying, oh, I'm going to copy that country so I can go out on the streets. No, they actually had legitimate reasons to do so. They just got inspired. In Bahrain, before the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution, people had no hope that they could create change. Those revolutions brought back that hope, that people can actually create change. But what's interesting about Bahrain is, Bahrain has a population of about 600 to 700,000 people, citizens, right? Bahrain per capita had the largest protests in all of the revolutions. More than 50% of the population was out on the streets. It didn't matter if you were, what sect you were from, or if you had a religion or not, or whether you believed in God or not, everyone was out on the streets. Because people believed in creating a country that was for everyone, in creating a country that represented and respected everyone equally. We got to a point in March 2011 where the regime in Bahrain had to decide. They either step down and allow for a civil government, or they go about creating real reforms. Because there was a huge national strike where almost everyone was not going to work. Teachers, students, professors, professionals or otherwise, nobody was going to work. People were coming to the Pearl Square. I remember they either arrive in their BMW convertibles or they arrive, on donkeys. Like this literally happened. So everyone from all parts of society were taking part in this. And what happened was the government made a decision. And where we saw a foreign military intervention in Libya, we also saw a foreign military intervention in Bahrain, but it was quite the opposite. We had forces from the UAE and from Saudi Arabia mainly, in the name of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, sent their troops over the bridge from Saudi Arabia into Bahrain. And they helped the regime in Bahrain to stay in power. How? By cracking down, arresting thousands and thousands of people, sacking up to 6,000 people from their jobs. Students were expelled from university and arrested. Torture was rampant. Physical, psychological, and sexual torture was practiced against people who were arrested. House raids. Every single night, people are staying up. I remember because I was in the United States at this time. I was one of the people who left the country right before the GCC forces came in. And every single night at 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning in Bahrain, everyone's awake. Because they know that's the time when the house raids happen. Within 30 seconds, your house door is broken down, and you have about 25 masked men standing in your living room. And your family members get beaten up, and someone gets taken away. And then sometimes for up to a month or 2 months, you don't know if they're alive or dead, because you can't find them. And this was a situation for hundreds and thousands of families in Bahrain. One of them is my own. And the thing about Bahrain is that nobody really knows what's going on there because there's not much media coverage. But the protests never stopped. Since February 14th, 2011, the protests in Bahrain have been happening almost on a daily basis. Every single day, between 15 to 25 different areas come out to protest in Bahrain. Every single day. And every single day they are attacked by the security forces, most of whom are non-Bahraini. Because even the Bahraini security forces are not Bahraini. They're politically naturalized people from places like Syria and Yemen and Jordan and Pakistan and India. This is the situation in Bahrain right now. We're still looking at a situation where if you are out on the streets, even if you're not in a protest, and you get hurt, because the riot police, of course, they shoot at everyone. They don't care who you are. We had a 5-year-old child who lost his eye a few months ago because he was shot with pellets. Even if you are not a protester and you get hurt, don't even think about going to the hospital. Because the hospitals are militarized, and if you go to the hospital, you either won't receive the treatment that you need, because they will interrogate you for hours. I documented myself the case of a 17-year-old boy who was shot with a tear gas canister in his face, lost his left eye, and while he was going in and out of consciousness at the ICU in the hospital, there was a man from the public prosecution interrogating him, refusing that he receives medicine until he answers his questions. This is the situation in Bahrain today. And yet what the government did is they tried to turn it into a sectarian situation, as all great governments do. Because they know that their only power exists if they can divide up the country. And it doesn't matter that everyone in Bahrain is suffering. Yes, there is systematic marginalization and discrimination against one part of the country, or one part of the population. And yes, the crackdown was focused on a specific part of the population. But it was done so for political reasons. Not because there actually is a difference between the two groups. The Bahraini government knew that if they could frame the Bahraini revolution as being a Shia revolution, they could tie it to Iran. Because they can't say there are Sunnis and Shias protesting and then be like, oh, it's Iran behind it. It doesn't make sense. Although even the claim that Iran is behind these protests to begin with doesn't make sense. Because in what understanding does it make sense that a government like Iran would tell people, go on the streets and demand a democracy? It doesn't make sense in itself, right? But that's what they did. And the problem is that governments in the West took that excuse on a golden platter and said, you know what, we're not going to do anything because it's the big bad guy in the Middle East, so we can't really get involved in this. And so I'll end with this. You know, one of the most important things for us is accountability. When we're talking about human rights, what causes human rights to stop or to continue? It's always accountability. The lack of accountability causes the human rights violations to continue. In Bahrain and in the Gulf in general, we have a lack of accountability on two levels. On a local level, where people who work for the government, whether in the security forces or whether high officials, like the king's son, who was directly involved in torturing political leaders in Bahrain, and then a few months later was a VIP guest at the Olympics in London. This is the reality that we're living. These people get away with whatever they do, and that's the problem. But then even more problematic than that are the so-called democracy-loving countries who are allied to these regimes and who allow them to get away with these violations internationally. The Bahraini government is not changing, not because, you know, there's a situation that causes them to not want to change. It's because there's no accountability. They know they can get away with it. They know there will be no steps taken forward against them internationally. And that's a big part of the problem. And there are two kinds of human rights violations, in my opinion. There are the people who commit the violations themselves, like the security forces or the government or whoever it is. But then there are the human rights enablers, the human rights violations enablers. When we have EU companies selling spyware technology to Bahrain and to other countries that enable them to then track down human rights defenders and put them in prison and torture them, this is a problem. Because these EU companies should be held accountable. Unfortunately, they're not today. So I think, you know, for me, one of the main issues, if we want to see change, not only in Bahrain, but across the world, accountability is at the forefront of that. We need to make sure that there aren't double standards. When we talk about human rights, it's human rights for everyone. Regardless, it doesn't matter of people's political, religious, or other kind of affiliations. And that's why for us in Bahrain, when the protests started in Kuwait, which became a huge issue, because some of the people protesting in Kuwait at the last year and this year are the same people who supported the entrance of the military into Bahrain. And the Bahraini people were like, well, of course we're not going to support them. They stood against us and they were, you know, cheering on the military groups when they attacked the people inside Bahrain. And for us as human rights defenders, we all came out and publicly supported the protests in Kuwait. And when they arrested the very same people who made statements supporting the military intervention in Bahrain, we defended him. Because for us, it doesn't matter what his political opinions are or his political affiliations. If he is demanding something that is just, if he is demanding something that is related to human rights, then we support him, regardless of who he is. And I think that's the note that I'm going to end on. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, but just to say something before I open it up to questions, I think the panel, excuse me, really illustrates the vast, you know, sort of sophistication as well as the complexity of working on and in the region on human rights. And so hopefully there will be some, you know, wonderful things growing out of our collaborations. But turn it now to you. When you ask a question, please briefly identify yourself and please try and keep your questions somewhat brief.
Okay, I'll break the ice.
Yay, Hashim.
My name is Hashim. So I saw. Hi. I'm a political science junior. And so the question that I have is, I saw a very underlying trend in what we were all saying. And we see that human rights activism in many of the countries is being shrouded with terrorism. So like with Bahrain, we're seeing an association with Iran, and it's being called a Shia revolution. In Egypt and Syria, we have its association with Muslim fundamentalism. So how can we try to create the strong distinction between a human rights activism that is inherently counter-terrorist and this attempt at making it seem like a terrorist act in order to suppress it or repress it or whatever?
Is there any one or two specific people you want to address your question? Or do you want me to pass the mic down there?
Flood me with information.
I think that's a very important point because, yes, that is something that is being used across the board in many countries. And one of the problems is that in many of these countries, like Bahrain, for example, the terrorism law is so vague that almost anything can be put under the terrorism law. And that's why almost all of the protesters who are being arrested these days in Bahrain are being tried under the terrorism law. And it is a big problem, but I think, you know, for me, one of the best ways to combat that is when human rights defenders work together. You know, when human rights defenders from Bahrain and Egypt and Syria and Yemen all go hand in hand, and they're all working together on the same issues, and they support each other, and they come out and speak for each other, that's when you combat all of these different ideas, right? Because how can someone be an Iranian agent if they're supporting the revolution or the human rights defenders in Syria? Or how can someone be a Muslim fundamentalist in Egypt if he's supporting human rights defenders in Bahrain? You know, it automatically breaks down those walls. And I think that's one of the most important things. But then also, like, on a very basic level, combating the idea that there is this Sunni Shia war in the region. You know, when the thing that I see the most today, or people love to talk about the most today, is presenting Saudi Arabia as being the savior of all Sunnis, and Iran as being the savior of all Shias. But if you take a microscope and you look at these two countries, the majority of political prisoners in Iran are Shia. And the majority of political prisoners in Saudi Arabia are Sunni. So how are they exactly the protectors of these two sects, right? This is something that is always used as a political tool for these governments to either stay in power or to exert their political influence on different countries. And so for us as human rights defenders, using human rights, when we stand up for every single person, regardless of their background, you know, and we say, it doesn't matter who the person is or what their affiliations are or their background or whatnot. If you are standing for justice, for human rights, I will stand by you. That automatically breaks down these walls and these things that the governments are trying to say are what, or is what it is, you know?
I think it is not true that human rights activists are seen as either terrorists or supporters of the Islamist movement in all countries. Definitely this is not the case in Egypt, it's not the case in Tunisia. I doubt that this is the case in Lebanon. So I think we passed this stage in many Arab countries. However, you know, the human rights movement in Arab countries does suffer from basic internal weaknesses. The first one is a reliance on foreign funding. You know, most of, you know, all the human rights organizations that I know of, no matter in which Arab country, relies very much on foreign funding. And this, you know, makes these movements, you know, easy to the charge that they are, I don't know, instruments in the hands of foreign powers, which have agendas opposed to Arab national interest. So this is one thing. The second thing is that there is a certain belief in human rights organizations, or there is a debate within the human rights movement, whether these movements should become movements, organizations of professionals or popular movements. And to make these movements really popular, this requires great efforts to diffuse the human rights culture, to be in touch with the people. And you know, somehow these skills are not met by human rights activists. So they end up hoping to establish professional organizations. Organizations made up of small number of people who are good at writing, you know, reports and, you know, contacting international organizations. And I think this in itself is very useful. but this would make the appeal of human rights quite limited to a small number of people. Thirdly, also, there is this view by the public that even when people are convinced of the importance of human rights, they see that human rights action is useless, does not go anywhere. So, it is very difficult to overcome these challenges. However, I think there is, one positive point about, all these regimes. They are not opposed to the teaching of human rights. So in a number of Arab countries, human rights are introduced at the level of, primary and secondary schools, and even at the level of universities. So I think by, using this possibility, I think it would be possible to diffuse a human rights culture, and this also will depend on how human rights, are taught in schools and in universities. But I think, the way out is, human rights education, and also for human rights activists. In fact, they do not, most of them, do not like to, make their own peace with the Arab culture. I think, many of them, I think most of them are really, pure secularists. I think, for the human rights discourse to become popular discourse, I think, human rights activists should know the Arab culture, should use, I don't know, Arab concepts, language. They should, I think there is no harm at all in using, Islamic or Christian texts in order to promote human rights culture. I think there are definitely, objectively, when we compare the universal concept of human rights and an Islamic concept of human rights, there will be, divergences. But there is also a large common ground. Of course, there are, at least depending on the interpretation, there could be problems in limits to freedom of belief. There could be problems in terms of gender equality. There could be also problems in terms of the equality of political rights among all people. But I think, there is still, a large common ground, and also much depends on the interpretation of Islamic texts. But I think, human rights activists should make their peace with Arab culture. And, the road is very long, but I think, it is possible to overcome all these challenges. Yeah.
This question is directed mostly to Eli and Maryam, because it seems like you're active in dealing with this question, but any of you can address it. I'm curious as to why more of the political forces in the uprisings haven't started using the language of rights and haven't gotten more interested in the idea of building rights-based communities that would transcend whatever the narrow political aims of their movements are. And I'm thinking specifically with a lot of sadness about the conditions in Egypt, where a small minority of activists involved in campaigns like No to Military Trials get very little buy-in from political forces that are trying to get shares of power in the transition. I think we can all think of a lot of examples from all the other countries, and the general disconnect I see is between folks who are speaking the language you're speaking about, rights that would pertain to your, to ex-regime and to your rivals as well as your political allies, versus those who are looking to essentially transition power to a new coalition of stakeholders, but not really change much about the way people are investigated or interrogated or detained, or how we define rights and citizenship.
You want to go first? You want to go first? I think with Bahrain, it's a bit tricky. You first of all have the political societies who are using the human rights discourse. What they've done, which is quite amusing to us, is that the political societies have now created human rights offices within their political societies. And they actually send people to places like Geneva and around the world to talk about human rights issues. But what we're also seeing is that there's a difference in discourse between the people on the streets and the political societies themselves. And I think that also creates a gap, which creates a problem, because the people on the streets in Bahrain, for example, who are the majority right now, or the majority of the opposition at least, are demanding the stepping down of the regime, the entire regime, including the king, the prime minister, the crown prince, all of them. whereas the political societies in Bahrain are demanding reforms. They're even calling it the revolution of reforms, which I don't really know how that works, but anyway. So there's a difference in discourse as well between the two groups. But they are using human rights language. I think at the end of the day, and this is something that was said at the very beginning of the revolution in Bahrain, is that people in Bahrain, of course, the human rights issues were a part of the discourse from the very beginning. When people stopped demanding reforms and they started demanding the stepping down of the regime, whenever there was a discussion on what they want to see next, people were discussing a civil government that institutionalizes human rights. This was something that was brought up a lot. So this was something that was already on people's minds, that they wanted to see this. But I think it's one of the things that makes it difficult, and I'm glad that this is changing to a certain extent in Bahrain, is the use of religion as a tool to garner political support. And this is one of the problems that I don't think we only have in Bahrain, but in a lot of places, where these political societies, basically tell people, well, we represent God on earth, so you need to elect us or you need to listen to what we say. And because people feel like to some extent they do have that kind of authority, they don't question what's happening. In Bahrain, that's changed because people are so upset with the position of the political societies. The largest political society in Bahrain, which is Al-Wafaq, has lost a lot of their popular support, even though they do also stand on religious grounds to garner political support. And so this is something, or a mentality, especially in Bahrain, that is changing, and it's changing quickly, where the youth every day are, splitting further apart from that kind of mentality and talking more about how they can bring about the change that they want to see and relying less on the political societies.
Well, some kind of a similar situation with both extremes and both parties in Lebanon all using human rights language, and I underline using, because they're only using it as a tool to fight the other. They are setting their own perception of what is human rights, and they are setting their own priorities on what human rights should be applied first. So they are using it, and the civil society needs to move away from that into the proper perception, the non-Hippocratic perception of human rights. So for example, we've been asked to choose between a capitalist who exploit people in his way of doing things, who claims that the human rights is of a person to be free to choose any religion, and another extremist Islamist, whether Sunni or Shiites, who claims, social equality and social justice. So, and a war criminal who calls for freedom of expression, or a war criminal who calls for justice. So this is unfortunately what we have to choose from, and we're happy with it. We're electing them every time, the same people. We haven't been able to create any new policy makers or politicians. We're still re-electing the same people in every elections, unfortunately.
Thanks. Jens Kambeck is my name. I'm a lawyer from Germany and affiliated researcher here at the Orient Institute in Beirut. I have two questions to, first of all, thank you to the panel. It was very, very informative, very enlightened to listen to your talks. Still, I'm personally working on Yemen, so I have a question to Sheila. Thanks for the overlook to the political history of Yemen from 1990 onwards. You said it's a very important thing for you to see the tribesmen going to the demonstrations without their weapons. That was something I also, when I did my research, field research in Yemen, I always heard as one very important thing. And I just wanted to add that many people told me it was not the tribal leaders who initiated this step. It was seen as a revolution within the revolution, that the ordinary tribesman is leaving his weapon at home without having a call from his sheikh. And he went on and kind of forced tribal leaders to react and then take a position pro-protest, which was not clear at the beginning. And this was something just to probably add to this point, which I think is very, very important, particularly to understand the northern tribal situation. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, whether I'm right or wrong, I see a very different situation in, for example, Sana'a or Taiz or the south of Yemen if it comes to human rights issues. recently, you know, Shouki Ahmed Hai was elected governor in Taiz. He, as far as I understand, leaves space for human rights activists and organizations, and implements their work as much as possible to his administration. And this is very, very different to the situation I see in Hadramaut or in Sana'a, or especially in the south. Do you agree to that special situation? The second question goes to you. I beg your pardon, I didn't get your name first. Thanks. You said Lebanese schizophrenia, human rights standards apply as long as they serve my purpose. That is not a Lebanese issue. I've been working for Amnesty International in Germany for 10 years. It is either a German and a Lebanese one, or it's an international one. That's something. And you said torture is not forbidden. I don't really understand that, because harming, insulting, killing someone is forbidden according to the law. So if you do it as a policeman or interrogator or a private person, law applies to everybody in every situation. It seems to me that this torture is not forbidden. Torture is just a wrap around all these elements: insulting, harming, killing someone. So the problem seems to me to be more the execution of laws and the monitoring of the actual situation in the interrogation room, in the courtrooms, in the judicial institutions. And as just the last idea to add is, I've been living here for 2.5 years now, and I've heard a couple of situations where foreigners have been kindly asked to come to the Amn al-Am and answer a couple of questions. And the situation which they described afterwards was a situation which would have been judged differently in Germany. Let's put it like that. And I do not see a proper reaction from the embassies in that situation. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, when I saw you, I was thinking you probably could have given just as interesting or more interesting a talk on Yemen as I did. And well, thank you. Actually, I can address the first question. The second one, you may have more information. That's why I just said what I said. In terms of the tribal leaders, thank you for that clarification, because it's true that the tribal leaders certainly did not order their men into the square without their weapons. To the contrary, many of the tribal leaders, particularly Hajjar, which is the president's tribe, wanted their followers to act like armed militias and fight on their side. So there's been, I think, overall in Yemen, not a complete, but a fairly extensive split between the political elite and the demonstrators. And the political elite clearly includes tribal leaders as well as military leaders and political leaders. And you see that also, I think, in the current national dialogue, which I didn't mention is a complicated story, but where the old elites, the guys who are 60 or more years old, are well represented and kind of jockeying among themselves for power. And the youth, the people who are under 30, not so much. And it's the younger tribesmen, I think, who went into the square or the squares in various places, because there was also a lot of geographic dispersion without their weapons in order to make a political point, and also presumably in order to not draw fire. I mean, there is an instrumental part of that. In terms of the governor of Taiz, I had not heard that. But on the other hand, it's not completely surprising that that would happen in Taiz, which has historically been probably the part of the country sort of between the north and the south, really. I mean, it's technically the north, but it's kind of between the north and the south. It's historically been the place where there's the greatest mobilization, where people have had relatively greater success influencing the governor and selecting the governor than elsewhere. and where, yeah, so that would be good news if you're correct, and I'll have to look into that. I'm going next week.
Okay. Concerning whether torture is a crime or not, I think it also goes back to our perception of what is violence and what is torture. The simple example that we always give is that there's a fight between a man or his wife or two men or whatever. If you call the police and say there's a fight, their question would be, is there any blood? And if you say no, they say, okay, we have nothing to do with that, and that's it. So our perception of what is violence and what is torture is very flexible, because we don't consider every act of mental, physical, or psychological harm is violence or is torture. That's where my first problem is. Second, when you talk about torture as an authority committing it in order to get confession or political action, this is not criminalized by the law. So the worst that can happen for that person who forced someone to confess something is for that someone to get disciplinary action for I don't know, something very minimal. And the second question, the gender security, is also a problem that I mentioned, which is the over-border authorities and the many different authorities that are doing many different things. And gender security is one of the security bodies in Lebanon that have exceeded the original mandate of its action and the way of doing its mandate. So yes, we have many issues with the gender security and how it is acting. Unfortunately, going back to the role of the embassies, there is always political interest in that. There is always things that are happening within that frame. So not every action is unfortunately condemned as well as it should be.
Thank you. My name is Karim, and I'm a student here at AUB. My question is directed at ED. A lot of you touched upon the issue of inspiration when it comes to revolutions. People actually taking the initiative to go to the streets and demand things that they want. In Lebanon, I think the Lebanese people have endured their fair share of socioeconomic injustice, and also when it comes to human rights. And what I've seen is that it's difficult to, nowadays, it's difficult to get the Lebanese people to actually maybe to express their opinion. Taking a political side, it's become sort of a taboo. For example, if you ask someone, I mean, what do you think? They say, إنه مخصني بالسياسة مثلا. For example. And I was just wondering, and what would it take for, in your opinion, of course, what would it take for the Lebanese people, Lebanese students or members of the civil society to be more inspired to take that extra step towards seeking actual change when it comes to finally getting our rights? And that's all. Thank you.
Before you answer, let me just say we'll take one more question. Is there, just so we can pass the microphone out there? Oh, back there. And then Omar has a question. He'll get the last question. But wait, can I answer the question?
Okay, this is our struggle. Huh? This is our suffering as instructors in the university, dealing with the youth, and as human rights activists. This demotivation of our youth is our biggest concern and our biggest problem. The Lebanese youth have been so disappointed many times over and over again by their leadership. But the thing that I cannot understand is, if you have been so disappointed, what's your stand? Do you pack and leave? That's what our youth is doing. And the only other option would be to stay and fight and learn the tools on how to fight and how to respond. And one of the tools is to hang on to human rights and face every leader with his obligations towards your human rights, your dignity as a human being, whether economic or social or educational. There's no magic formula, I guess. It's only awareness of our youth. That's what we're trying to do, and their education about the tools that they can use to see that. But they need to believe in that their ability of change and their ability to hang on to their essence and their value as human.
My name is Spencer Osberg. I'm a journalist. Quick comment. I think the first step to fixing Lebanon is breaking the sectarian system, and I think that happened yesterday with the registration of the first civil marriage. Next question is, just in the next year, what do you honestly see happening in Bahrain?
Depends on whether I feel optimistic or pessimistic today. I think it really depends. There are people who think it's going to take about 5 to 15 years for a change to come in Saudi Arabia. And everyone knows that once change comes to Saudi Arabia, it probably is going to come to the entire region because of their influence everywhere. But I think that the thing that for us keeps us optimistic is that the people of Bahrain, albeit they feel isolated and ignored, but they've decided that they want to continue until they get what they want. And you know, when I was in Bahrain last January, the thing that I heard the most from people, the word that everyone now uses to even greet each other, so when you see someone on the street that you know, or when you're saying goodbye, is sumud, which means perseverance. This is the most popular word in Bahrain today. And because of this, because of the idea that no government can outlast its people, people believe that change will come. It's just a matter of time. I think given the situation right now, realistically, with the international position on Bahrain and the Gulf, I think things are going to get much, much worse. I think we're going to see a lot more violence. I think we're going to spiral down into a situation where, you know, where we could have had an influence before, or where, you know, other players could have had an influence before, we'll lose that kind of influence that they could have had. And I think the situation is going to get much worse before it gets better. But that's why we have to continue.
Just a small comment. I don't want to open the discussion. It's a huge discussion. But in my point of view, sectarianism is not the only and the main problem in Lebanon. Clientelism and feudalism and all these problems have to be, and corruption, all these have to be solved simultaneously, if not first, before sectarianism, because for me it's only a way of distributing power among the different groups in Lebanon. It's not that bad by itself if it's not coupled with all other things.
So I actually just wanted to probe a little bit from the discussion that we had today, this morning, because some points were not really kind of brought up. But I think one of the interesting things about the what's going on in different parts of the Arab world is not only these events of abuse of human rights, but actually mechanisms and transformations that are becoming more and more permanent, that defeats the possibility or the condition, or defeats the condition of human rights activism. So you know, some of the examples today that were brought up, and maybe the panelists could comment on those. The sacking of hundreds of thousands of Bahrainis, and then re-employing them with different kind of contracts that controls them in a completely different way, and has the possibility of kind of abusing them day to day through these new contracts, or the sacking of changing the age limits for the judges, the retirement age for judges in Egypt, which eventually will get many of the judges out to bring in new judges that are more pro kind of ideology of the current regime. And I think these kind of examples that were brought up today were very powerful, because they go beyond the kind of the event, but actually institutionalizing a kind of a regime or a mechanism that prevents any real and concrete changes. So I was kind of hoping that maybe the panelists will say a little bit about these small changes that have really, I find, have more of a long-term impact in the future. Yes, Sheila, you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have good material on that particular point, but I will go back to a question which was one of the very first ones, and I think that person left, to say that, you know, one dimension of that is also before the revolution, and in fact, revolutions, and in fact, in some ways laying the groundwork for the revolutions, is, you know, anti-terrorism legislation in so many countries in the Arab world, which then becomes a kind of smokescreen for crackdowns and allegations about the nature of the protests. And that can sometimes be gargantuan, but sometimes it's of the subtle nature that you're mentioning. And so I would underscore that.
Instead of making points, I think I'm just going to share a very quick story. After my father was arrested, and the situation in Bahrain was very depressing at the time. He had been severely tortured. My family went to visit him in prison, and they were very depressed because of the situation. And when he saw them, he asked them what was wrong, and they said, well, you know, we're not receiving any help from the outside. Whether they're Westerns or the Arabs, they've all forgotten about us. And we feel like we've been completely isolated from the world, and the government can do whatever they want to us. And so there's this sense of depression across the country. And my father told them, your attitude is wrong. Because the actual victory of these movements is not the regime change, and not whether people are able to change the regime or not. The actual victory of these movements is the fact that people actually went out onto the streets. That's what actually matters. Because the fact of the matter is, everywhere where I go, I hear people saying, they broke down that barrier of fear, or they broke down the wall of fear. That's not true. The fear still exists because the consequences are still very real. You can still be killed or tortured or beaten or whatnot. The fear is still there. It's finding a cause that is worth going out for despite the fear, not because the fear is no longer existent. And that's the initial victory. That's the actual victory of all of these movements. And what comes after that is just part 2. And that's what we need to keep working on. But the initial victory that we need to continue to celebrate on a daily basis is the fact that people came out to begin with.
I think we should not really generalize. I think the wall of fear has been demolished, definitely in Egypt and in Tunisia and in many other Arab countries. And therefore, I do not think that the situation which had prevailed before the revolution could be restored. I think there is no way that the Mubarak-like regime could be restored in Egypt, or Ben Ali's regime could be restored in Tunisia. I think this is really finished, and it is finished because also the human rights discourse, perhaps it is not used, but human rights as concepts are taken for granted. So when people protest against torture or against sexual harassment, or against inequality of treatment between Muslims and Christians in Egypt, I think they do this because they have assimilated concepts of human rights. Moreover, also there is no one single political force which dominates the political scene in these countries, not in Egypt, nor in Tunisia, or Libya, or Yemen. And therefore, no political force is capable of imposing its will on the majority of people. So, of course, there will be, human rights problems in these countries, but I think there are also ways of resisting the violation, and we are talking also about a situation which is qualitatively different from the situation which had existed before. And, referring to the case of the judges in Egypt, I don't think this law would pass. And even if it passes, it would not be implemented. And if it is implemented, it will be implemented for a short period of time, because, people have the means to resist, and the resistance is quite effective. We should also recognize the fact that, these revolutions put the Islamists on the test, under a very severe test, and they are failing this test. They are not, achieving what the people revolted for. So I don't think that we are replacing authoritarian regimes by a new type of, Islamist dominated regime. I think there is no way to establish such regimes now because of the multiplicity of forces and because the Islamists are not doing well in power.
Just a small note. I don't think in most cases governments have the flexibility of institutionalizing human rights violations. It's becoming less and less possible. But I think the only and the best response that as a human rights activists or believers in human rights that we can have against that is the way we act and the way we adopt the human rights as impartial as it can be and as credible as it can be. So hopefully it would be the cross-sectarian and cross-cultural and cross-human common ground that we can together unite on.
We have kept it exactly in the time, and I want to thank all of you for coming and our wonderful panelists for bringing some really edifying and critical insights. Thank you all.